All right, hi everybody. Gonna wait a couple minutes here to let a few more people hop on. See the number climbing there, that's great. Hope you're all staying warm, enjoying some decent weather. All right, okay, we're gonna get rolling. Hi everybody, thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Michelle Allison and I'm the publisher of Top Crop Manager magazine. I'm joined today by Dr. Christy Preston, Senior Agronomist with Nutrien. Christy grew up in Southwest Virginia and had interest in crop and animal agriculture since an early age. She received a Bachelor of Science degree in Animal Science and a Master's of Science degree in Crop and Soil Environmental Science from Virginia Tech. She holds a PhD in agronomy from Kansas State University, and while completing her advanced degrees, Christy conducted more than 6 years of field and laboratory research. She has experience in laboratory research measuring volatility loss from urea-based fertilizers, and her field research has focused on the availability of phosphorus and its interactions with tillage and placement. She also has extensive experience with large data sets and complex data analysis. Her main priority is helping growers identify yield limiting factors and fixing those issues as efficiently as possible. Today, during our session, Dr. Preston will discuss sulfur application recommendations. Today's webinar is brought to you by Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST. Experience the latest, most efficient fertilizer system for delivering sulfur and phosphate to your crops when they need it. Learn how to boost your soil's performance and maximize ROI with Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST at smartnutritionmst.com. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to all registrants approximately 24 hours after our live broadcast. This session is scheduled to run for approximately 45 minutes, and Christy will present. Following her presentation, and we'll open up the floor for any questions. If you have any questions throughout her presentation, please type them into the questions tab found on the GoToWebinar panel on your computer screen. This webinar has been approved for 1 CCA CEU credit in nutrient management, and your CCA number was recorded at registration for submission. So without further ado, I will let Christy take it away.
All right, thanks, Michelle. As Michelle said, my name is Dr. Christy Preston. I am a senior agronomist with Nutrien. I've been with Nutrien for about 4 years now, and mainly I cover the Midwest region for the agronomy team. Today, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about sulfur application recommendations, and at the very end, I will discuss how our Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST product can fit into your sulfur management program. I feel like we've all seen this map of the US, and forgive me, there's not the same data available for the Canadian provinces, but this will give you an idea of how sulfur deposition has changed over the years. And as you can see, back in 1986, these darker red areas we were getting sulfur deposition from acid rain. Now, what really has changed over time to maybe cause me to see sulfur deficiency in some of my plants, and it all comes back to the Clean Air Act from around 1970s, which has also been updated since then. But if we think to today's sulfur deposition map here up here in the upper corner from 2016, we're not seeing the red areas or the high amounts of sulfur deposition that we have historically seen. And this is potentially negatively affecting yield in those areas as farmers have mined the soil year after year and not supplied enough sulfur to maximize crop production. Now, there are several other reasons why we're seeing sulfur deficiency, and those can include purification of a lot of fertilizer products. So today's fertilizers don't have as much sulfur in them as traditional. and also lower application rates. As we increase yields and get higher and higher removal rates, farmers are not consistently applying enough sulfur. So how exactly do I determine if what I'm seeing out in my field is sulfur deficiency? And the first step is to understand the difference between nutrient mobility within the soil and within the plant. So sulfur is mobile within the soil profile as sulfate. Coarser textured soils have a higher probability of sulfate leaching, kind of like if we think about nitrate nitrogen leaching. But just because a nutrient is mobile within the soil profile doesn't necessarily mean it's mobile within the plant. And how mobility within the plant is going to help us determine where we see those sulfur deficiency symptoms. But the nutrients that are mobile within the plant are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And this means that they are translocated to the newer developing portions of the plant. Immobile nutrients like sulfur, you're going to see sulfur deficiency symptoms in those newer growing portions because the sulfur that's already been taken up is not being transported to those newer growing portions. And because the soil's not supplying enough sulfur, that's why you're going to see those sulfur deficiency symptoms. So sulfur deficiency, exactly what does it look like? And again, it's going to occur in the younger portion of the plant. Think about it as the younger portion of the plant is the most upper portion because it's the point that you're going to want to see the most photosynthesis. And if it's chlorotic or sulfur deficient, it's not going to produce as much oxygen for the plant, or take in as much oxygen or carbon dioxide and produce oxygen for us in the process of photosynthesis. So again, you'll see this chlorosis or the yellowing of the leaves. And as the plant gets bigger, you can actually start to see like the interveinal chlorosis or this nice striping within the plant. This bottom picture is 2 wheat leaves. The one on the left is sulfur deficient. You can see that it is very chlorotic compared to the one on the right that's got more of a dark green color. Sulfur deficiency can also be shown in the stalks and flower buds. And in general, if it's early enough in the growing season, it may just be smaller, spindly plants. And sulfur deficiency has been shown to negatively affect maturity, so delaying maturity if the plants are sulfur deficient. This is a diagram from IPNI that shows in general where you're going to see deficiency symptoms based on whether or not the nutrient is mobile within the plant. As you can see, the older leaves or these older tissues down at the bottom of the plant, since these nutrients are translocated, this is where you're going to see the deficiency symptoms. So nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium. If you think about at the end of the growing season and you walk into the field and you see a corn plant that is the lower leaves are fired because of nitrogen deficiency, that's why. That nitrogen is being translocated within the plant to those upper growing portions and it leaves those lower portions fired. Sulfur deficiency, again, going to show up in these younger growing portions of the plant. And that's how the main difference of how you can tell if it's nitrogen or sulfur deficiency if you were to walk into a field. So just briefly, sulfur function within a plant, it's required for protein synthesis. So required for 3 of the main amino acids. It aids in seed production and producing chlorophyll. Guess what? A plant's #1 goal in its life cycle is to produce viable seed. And so if your plants are sulfur deficient, guess what? Your seed production and protein content of that seed may be negatively effective. It's also required for nodule formulation on the root hairs of legume crops. So crops like soybeans that have a way of biologically fixing nitrogen, adequate sulfur is needed to aid in that relationship with the rhizobia and therefore allow the soybean plant to produce or to fix its own nitrogen. Deficiency symptoms in wheat can result in low grain quality, and this can affect the bakeability of that wheat as it's made into flour. And of course, fun facts, because I like to find interesting facts whenever that's involved with nutrient management, that sulfur is actually responsible for the flavor and smell of garlic. And if you've ever cut into an onion and your eyes begin to water because they're burning, that's actually because of sulfur. So I bought a bag of onions the other day, and immediately when I cut into it, I could just, I could just smell the onion, and of course my eyes began to water. I had a feeling that those onion plants weren't sulfur deficient because they had adequate smell and flavor. So when we talk about sulfur in soils, sulfur is mainly found as organic matter in soils or crop residue. But these organic compounds have to be broken down and converted. The organic forms are converted to, say, sulfate before the plant can take them up. This process is actually variable. I mean, it is based on soil moisture, it's based on soil temperature, any soil characteristic that is potentially going to affect a microbe, your microorganisms are going to affect the speed at which organic matter is broken down and sulfur is made available to the plant. At this time, I would like to ask our organizers to run a quick poll that you will see on your screen. And that poll is, so organic matter can supply enough sulfur to plants so much that I could potentially not see a response to fertilizer application. And what this means is, if the organic matter has to be broken down to make sulfate available to the plants, how high can my organic matter be for the sulfur to be available that could maximize crop production? And we're going to run this poll for, say, about 30 seconds to a minute. But sulfate is generally soluble within the soil profile, and it readily moves with the roots. So our biggest concern is, when it comes to nutrient management for sulfur, is that the form of sulfur that is applied is leached through the soil profile. So if we take a look at the sulfur cycle, if sulfate is the only form that is taken up by the plant, then we need to make sure that it is available throughout the entire growing season, and it also depends on what form of sulfur is being applied. So we just got the results from the poll, and actually the majority of you thought that that was FOSS. But I hate to tell you, but the answer is actually true. A lot of times these higher organic matter soils, say above 3% up to 8 or 9%, can actually supply enough sulfur that you may not see a crop response to additional fertilizer application. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. Let me take a step back and say that farmers don't necessarily want to see a response to fertilizer application. That, to me, that means that I'm potentially leaving yield in the field, because if my crop's still potentially responding to fertilizer applications, that means that I might not be applying enough, or there's not enough available in the soil. And so, thinking back to sulfur being supplied by organic matter, the reason why it's not a good predictor for, there's not a good way of predicting how much sulfur will be made available from organic matter, because the processes are so variable. Whether it's say in the Manitoba, Saskatchewan, or even the north central US, where we see cooler soils during the season, we're not necessarily getting that mineralization of the organic matter, and sulfur is not necessarily made available. But if those soils do warm up, we could potentially see enough sulfur supplied to the plant that we wouldn't necessarily see a response to fertilizer application. Anyway, going back to the sulfur cycle, sulfate leaching is the #1 priority whenever we think about whether or not my sulfur is going to be plant available. And so this brings up the question of, what fertilizer source do I need to use to ensure that the sulfur is available after it's applied? Now, the elemental form, as you can see, needs to be oxidized to sulfate to be plant available. Any type of fertilizer that includes sulfate, so say ammonium sulfate, the fertilizer is going to be readily available, and so say could be applied in season. Elemental sulfur will have to take some time to be oxidized to the sulfate form and then plant available. But again, this shows other inputs and losses from the system, but the biggest concerns that we're going to focus on today is the potential for sulfate leaching and the oxidation rates of elemental sulfur. So IPNI, every 5 years or so, they put together the soil tests that fall below, say, a certain level. For mainly the phosphorus and potassium soil tests, they always compare it to the critical level. And since there's so much variability with using the soil test levels, we're not capable of establishing critical levels for sulfur. And that has to do with all kinds of soil characteristics, and we'll actually get into the limitations here in a minute. But I just wanted to give you a general idea of the percentage of soil samples that test below 3 part per million within the US and in some of the Canada provinces. Again, in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, we don't see such high percentages. But as we get down here into, say, the Corn Belt within the US, and maybe some of these states that have coarser textured soils in the southeast, we're seeing high concentrations of or high quantities of soil tests that are testing low for sulfur. And what that really means is we're drawing down the soil over time. We're not getting the sulfur deposition from acid rain, as we talked about at the very beginning, and we're maybe not necessarily applying enough sulfur. So over time, we are seeing a decrease in trend of soils that are testing above 3 part per million, say in this case. Now, we are seeing an increase in number of soil samples that are taken and analyzed for sulfur, and I believe that's a good trend to be having, that we are soil testing. But again, we're going to talk about the limitations of the soil sample and analyzed for sulfur, and how we're not necessarily seeing a consistent crop response with increasing soil test levels. There is not, research has found that there's not a relationship between soil test and yield, and this can affect not having a critical value that a farmer may fertilize to ensure that he might not necessarily see a crop response. Sulfur is very variable within, or can be very variable within the field due to the potential for sulfate leaching. Now, leaching losses occur in low organic matter and coarse textured soils, or the potential is higher in those types of soils. Another reason why the soil test sulfur may have a limitation is because the mineralization from organic matter is unpredictable. A lot of universities use organic matter percentages in their recommendations because there is some expectation of sulfur to be made available, but we're not exactly completely sure on how much could potentially be available. And of course, natural field variability. Now, if we think about the root structure of plants, it is possible that, say, a corn plant where the roots are growing multiple feet underground, that they are capable of reaching higher organic matter subsoil or soil that has accumulated sulfur year after year. This can affect like how deep you should take your soil sample, but it all comes back to what the universities recommend. Definitely recommend you reaching out to your soil test laboratory if you do plan on taking soil tests and having them analyzed for sulfur, and trying to make recommendations off of that, because they can give you a better idea of what depth to take the sample. Specifically here in Kansas, I know the Kansas State Soil Testing Lab, they do recommend a 2-foot sample or a profile sample, and try to make recommendations off of that. But since there's not a consistent response to increasing soil test levels, we're not able to identify, say, a critical level that you should fertilize up to ensure that you're not going to see a fertilizer response after that. So even at, say, 80 part per million, up to 120, up to 160 part per million sulfate soil test here, we're still seeing a crop response above, that's the dots that are above 100% in this graph. So anywhere from, say, 20 pounds of sulfur per acre up to 160, we're still seeing potential for sulfur response. So what does that tell me? That tells me that if I don't have an adequate soil test to help me predict how much sulfur is in the soil right now, I need to look at other methods, like, say, sulfur removal rates or sulfur uptake needs for the previous and future crops that I'm going to be growing. One limitation is natural field variability. This graph is from North Dakota State University. I believe it's some work that Dave Franson has done looking at how variable sulfur can be within, say, a 40-acre field there in North Dakota. So we're seeing high sulfate depressions in some of these lower areas, and low sulfate in the low organic matter upland coarse textured soils. So looking at a field's topography may give you some idea of where you're going to see sulfur deficiency or sulfur accumulation. But I guess the biggest comment that I'd like to make here is this shows how well topography graphs and soil textures and also yield, how they can all be combined together to make a sulfur management plan for, say, your 40-acre field. So your poll question was in regards to organic matter and if that could supply enough sulfur to meet my crop production. And the answer was yes. And so this day and age, gosh, we like to talk about building organic matter. That'll tie up the nitrogen, but it'll also tie up the sulfur too. But it's not the mere presence of organic matter, it's the actual breakdown of organic matter that gives life to the soil. So if we're attempting to build organic matter, that's like courting gold, okay? But it's not necessarily the correct answer, because organic matter, its function is in the decay and the breakdown of it that supplies the nutrients to the plants. This is a good segue into a conversation on how organic matter supplies both nitrogen and sulfur and how they interact within the plant to maximize protein production. So each plant has a specific nitrogen to sulfur ratio that we can use for several benefits to the farmer. And so pretty much you need to make sure that you're applying enough sulfur to maximize your nitrogen applications, because several studies have shown that when nitrogen is limiting, sulfur deficiency may not be as severe. But if nitrogen is adequate, there's no signal to the rest of the plant to deconstruct these nitrogen compounds that are in the older leaves. Again, because nitrogen is mobile within the plant and can be translocated to the new growing portions. If nitrogen is adequate, then your sulfur deficiency is going to be more severe, because sulfur is not mobile within the plant. And this is important for, say, right now here in Kansas, here in the next month or so, we're going to see winter wheat coming out of dormancy. And as that plant greens up, it's going to need more nitrogen, but it's also going to need sulfur if I want to maximize the protein content in that grain. The same goes for canola. And so even though canola may not need as much, canola actually needs more sulfur to nitrogen within the plant than, say, soybean or wheat. Canola would need about 1 pound of sulfur for every pound of nitrogen that's applied. And I know we have talked a lot about sulfur application to canola over the years, but I still don't think we're applying enough sulfur to maximize the protein production, and how that affects my end use of a lot of these grain crops. If I don't have the protein content, that may affect, how my feeding ratios to cattle, if that's the end product of my crop production. But anyway, so take home message is crops do vary with requirements of sulfur compared to nitrogen, but some crops do require more sulfur compared to others. That brings up Liebig's law of the minimum. And if we think about the scenario that I just discussed, if I'm continually applying enough nitrogen to where it's not limiting, but sulfur is still limiting, I'm still potentially losing yield out this sulfur hole in the dam here. So the dam is holding back all of my yield potential. And if I've got a hole or a nutrient deficiency, if I don't plug it, then I'm still going to potentially be losing yield or leaving yield in the field. To give you a general idea of one question that's came up this week is, talking about sulfur rates, okay? Since there's not a good soil test method for trying to determine maybe what sulfur I might need to apply, specifically for corn, if I'm looking at, say, 200 bushel, I'm going to need about 134 pounds of nitrogen. Okay, let's take a step back. I'm not going to need 134 pounds. This is how much is going to be removed in the 200 bushel yield that is produced. this is a good place to start if I am trying to focus on removal rates from the previous year. So if my crop last year was 200 bushel corn, I have removed 134 pounds of nitrogen, 70 pounds of phosphorus, 50 pounds of potassium, and 16 pounds of sulfur. That's where those nitrogen to sulfur ratios come from. For canola, if I grew 50 bushel canola, I'm looking at removing 80 pounds of nitrogen, 40 pounds of phosphorus, 20 pounds of potassium, and roughly 13 pounds of sulfur to give me a 6-to-1 ratio. And again, I also want to mention that sulfur was needed for the rhizobia interaction of a legume crop so that those crops like soybeans or alfalfa can maximize their biologically fixed nitrogen and maximize yield that way. But again, look how variable the rates are for sulfur. Assuming that this same field that could produce 200 bushel corn could also produce 50 bushel canola, the rates, roughly 4 pounds, but each crop does need different amounts of sulfur. If we look at, or if we think about when do I need my sulfur to be available, and that's my number one concern in my sulfur management program. So I want to decrease my chances of sulfate leaching, and I want to maximize production. When does the sulfur need to be available the most? Now, for corn production, we're talking about anywhere from planting to V10, V14 here. There's a slow lag of sulfur to uptake. But then once I get up to, say, the R1 stage or the reproductive stage, if you look over here on the left side of the graph, or sorry, the right side of the graph for the percent of total sulfur uptake, half of my sulfur is taken up during those vegetative stages, and half of my sulfur is also taking up at that R1 stage. Now this means half of it is going to be taken up after that R1 stage, and it's not going to be translocated within the plant, and the majority of it is going to be assimilated in this grain area. Now what that means is I need to make sure that I have enough sulfur available throughout the growing season and specifically later in the growing season to maximize this sulfur uptake and this sulfur in the grain. Again, to maximize protein content, to maximize production. Now, canola is a little bit different story. As the canola plant grows, yeah, we have still the same lag time early in the growth season. But once the crop begins to flower, then sulfur uptake increases dramatically. And as you can see on the axis on the left, around that 50% point, we're seeing that 50% is taken up between the beginning of flowering and at 50% flowering. So we need to make sure that we have adequate amounts of sulfur available within that growing period. The right sulfur source. So there are pretty much two sources of sulfur in fertilizer. You've got your sulfate sulfur, which plants take up sulfate, so the sulfur is readily available. It's ideal for in-season applications, and it's ideal for in-season applications. The biggest con with sulfate sulfur fertilizers are the potential for leaching, and this is mainly in coarse textured soils or soils low in organic matter. Elemental sulfur fertilizer sources, they have to be oxidized to sulfate to become plant available. And this oxidation rate depends on the sulfur particle size and its distribution within the fertilizer. But then it also, since oxidation is a microorganism driven process, any soil weather or any soil characteristic that affects the microbe community will also affect oxidation rates. So soil temperature, aeration, soil moisture. And this is actually a big question for this Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST product that we have, where the sulfur is present as the sulfur is present as elemental, and in cooler temperature growing geographies, do we see the oxidation rates that we need to maximize production with the sulfur that's being applied? So switching over to the Smart Nutrition product, again, elemental sulfur has to be oxidized to sulfate before the plants can use it. Any process or any soil factor that potentially affects the microbe community, soil temperature, moisture, aeration, is going to affect how much sulfur is available from the fertilizer product that's applied. When we talk about the fertilizer factors, we're talking about sulfur size. And so as you can see, traditional elemental sulfur products, the sulfur particles, or these circles within the granule, how they're bigger, and as you get down to more specialty products, they are getting smaller. The Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST product has very fine particle size, about 15 microns on average, and they are evenly distributed within the granule. So that even distribution means that I'm maximizing the fertilizer to soil contact, and therefore my oxidation rates should be maximized. So when we talk about how this product might potentially fit into your sulfur management in canola and wheat, we want to make sure that we're applying enough sulfur. And many of the common practices in the Manitoba area, the Saskatchewan, if I'm applying say MAP in furrow with the seed at planting, I just did a brief calculation here. If I was focusing on 20 pounds of phosphorus as my application rate, that would be roughly 46 pounds of this MAP plus MST, or 943.0, 16% sulfur. That's only supplying 7.5 to 8 pounds per acre of sulfur, and that's an issue. It's a great product that can be applied in furrow because it does carry a lower calculated salt index compared to MAP, compared to AMS, and compared to urea. So it is ideal for going in furrow with either canola or wheat seed. Here in Kansas, farmers actually pre-mix their MAP or DAP with their wheat seed, a couple of days before planting, and then we'll go out and plant it. And actually, I think this is going to be a good product for that as well. But if I'm applying based on a phosphorus rate that I have to be conscious of, I need to make sure that I watch how much sulfur is being supplied in that product, because it's not going to be enough sulfur to maximize your canola production. As we saw with the table earlier, that 50 bushel canola needs around 12 to 13 pounds of sulfur. That's how much is going to be removed. Guess what? It's going to take up more than that. That's just what's being removed in the grain, and giving me a good starting point for how much I might apply this year if that's what I removed last year. So how does it work? So Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST. MST is a patented technology where the elemental sulfur size has been micronized, again, around that 15 micron size. Smaller particle size allows for quicker oxidation. So if we think about many farmers apply granular elemental sulfur and to their soils, and that sulfur will eventually become available. But granular elemental sulfur, the sulfur particle size in it is so big that it's going to take additional time for that sulfur to become oxidized and available. By decreasing the particle size of the sulfur, we can increase the surface area, and that should allow for quicker elemental sulfur. Now, the MAP plus MST product itself, we've taken the MST and we've integrated it into our MAP production facility. So that it's not a layering process. We're able to evenly distribute the MST within the MAP granule, and that allows for maximum soil to fertilizer contact. With the sulfur being present as elemental sulfur, that does allow versatility with timing of application. So we've kind of already focused on in furrow and how it's safe for seed placement, but what about fall applications? If sulfate leaching is my #1 concern for losses from losses from the soil profile, and when I say soil profile, I mean the root zone. If that's my #1 concern, then applying an elemental form in the fall is a great option. We've done considerable research in, say, the Indiana, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin area, looking at fall application versus spring with MAP plus MST versus AMS. Now, when we approach field trials like this, we like to compare to AMS because, again, the sulfur is present as sulfate, so it's readily plant available, and so if it's applied in the fall, it has the greatest chance of being leached because it's already in the sulfate form. Well, actually in the spring as well. So if you do have soil conditions that are prone to sulfate leaching, AMS is probably not your best bet. But since it does carry such a high potential for losses, if we compare the elemental forms to that and our yields reach similar amounts, we can say that the oxidation from the MAP plus MST is high enough that sulfur is not limited to the plant. So across trials, looking at this fall versus spring application, we see a nice sulfur response from the application of both MAP plus MST and AMS. And a lot of times that's our #1 issue with field trials, especially in this north central region where the organic matters are higher, and therefore the potential for sulfur to be made available to the plant is higher. We see this nice sulfur response, and we also see higher yields with the MAP plus MST product compared to the AMS. And this could be due to several reasons. If sulfur was lost due to leaching, we haven't pinpointed down, but we feel safe to say that a fall application will protect the sulfur from being leached this fall, and the sulfur will be made available next spring. When looking at canola, so again, the oxidation rates of the elemental sulfur in any specialty product that contains elemental sulfur, the oxidation rates, if the soil temperatures are not warm enough, long enough, we might potentially see sulfur limited because you're not getting the oxidation rates. And that's part of what allows us to apply it in the fall, because as those soil temperatures cool down, we're not getting the microbial activity, and that protects it until next spring. However, what happens in some of our production areas where the soil temperatures still continuously stay cooler longer, we might not necessarily see a sulfur response with MAP plus MST due to the low oxidation rates. And these are some of the areas where we suggest that farmers blend MAP plus MST with AMS. Again, AMS having sulfur present as sulfate, so it's readily plant available and can be taken up right away. But using MAP plus MST to at least supply your phosphorus and part of your sulfur rates. And again, talking back earlier to our example of if I'm using, say, MAP plus MST at a phosphorus rate and applying it in furrow, and I'm only applying half of my sulfur, I need to make sure that I'm applying another form of sulfur to get those yields highest, because I'm not seeing, I definitely see a difference here between MAP plus MST and AMS for sulfur availability. I will add in, though, AMS is not a good product to apply in furrow with your seed because of the nitrogen content if I'm trying to apply enough sulfur. And so if I were to use MAP plus MST in furrow and then come in at, say, just before flowering and applied AMS, that could be a good option for canola production in the Manitoba, Saskatchewan area. So just to sum up, the Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST, again, an average particle size of 15 microns that allows for quicker oxidation compared to, say, granular elemental sulfur. That means earlier availability to a crop, but at the same time, it also acts as a slow release fertilizer, allowing for that sulfur to be available later on, especially in environments that have weather patterns that are subject to sulfate leaching. Ideal for bulk blending. We didn't really discuss that very much, but the granular size and the non-caking ability of the fertilizer allows it to be bulk blended with urea without caking, due to limited moisture accumulation. And again, big on performance because it carries a low salt index, delivering more seed row safety. We've done extensive studies in canola looking at the potential for burn as the plant grows, and we see very little effect on yield. High analysis for decreased application rates, being able to maximize phosphorus and sulfur rates. It's safe to handle and store. It's an enhanced product combining phosphorus and sulfur, and of course, because of its homogeneous distribution, that means that the granules have consistent nutrient percentages. Again, it's not a layering process, it's a co-granulated form of fertilizer. I'd like to thank Top Crop for this opportunity to present to you today. If you would like more information on the Smart Nutrition product, visit us at smartnutritionmst.com. There is a section that for Ask the Agronomist. Please submit your questions there and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Please follow us on Twitter at smart_MST. And again, my name is Dr. Christy Preston, Senior Agronomist with Nutrien. And if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, it's at chelate_this. And at this time, we'll take some questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Christy, for a great presentation. We've got a lot of questions that came in here, so we'll try and get through as many as we can. To start us off, what is the best way to determine if I actually need to apply sulfur this year?
That's a great question, Michelle. A lot of times, sulfur and nitrogen deficiencies are going to look so similar whenever the plants are small. So what we like to recommend farmers do is if they have some areas within their field that are darker green, and then some areas that are that pale chlorotic looking areas, we suggest that they take plant tissue samples from both areas, keep them separate, and then also take a soil sample from those areas as well. So you've got the good area and then you've got the bad area, and do a comparative analysis. More and more research is being done to determine sufficiency concentrations of sulfur in many of our crops. Those I can't comment on specifically, but if we compare the tissue concentrations, we can see if there's, we can just do a comparative analysis and say, yes, this one is high in sulfur, this one's low in sulfur. And actually, we can, if you think back, we can look at those nitrogen to sulfur ratios as well to determine if it is sulfur deficiency.
Okay, perfect. All right, well, let's find another one here. So if I use MAP plus MST in furrow, can I apply enough to supply enough sulfur for that crop?
Yes, so based on the research that we have completed at this time, no, I don't think that you can apply enough Smart Nutrition MAP plus T in furrow to meet both the phosphorus limitations and meet the sulfur application. It seems as though many farmers are looking to apply that 20 pounds of phosphorus in furrow. And even if you bump that up, you would be applying, I would say if we doubled it, that would be applying 40 pounds of phosphorus in furrow and finally hitting your sulfur rate of about 13 pounds. If we're thinking about removal rates in a canola plant at 50 pounds per acre. So I don't think so. It's one of those things where if you're limiting your phosphorus application, I don't think you're going to be applying enough phosphorus or enough sulfur based on the ratio within the fertilizer. So my suggestion, and like I suggested in several of the last slides, is to come in with either MAP plus MST in the fall or earlier in the spring, and that way that sulfur is available, and apply it in furrow, or come over the top with, say, AMS and have that sulfur readily available then.
Okay, perfect. So how many pounds of MAP and MST can you safely put down to seed row with canola?
We are still conducting that research to make sure. So to be completely honest, so far we were kind of playing it safe with our rates and making sure that we weren't applying too much phosphorus. But this upcoming year we'll have additional studies that will look at going above and beyond the safe recommendations for phosphorus rates.
Okay, great, thanks.
It's one of those things where traditionally our phosphorus rates have been adequate enough to, they haven't been as high as what was needed now with increasing yields. We're also seeing we're needing more and more phosphorus. So that is some research that we're working on.
Perfect. Okay, thank you. We've got a question from the Yukon. Can you speak to sulfur availability if applied to soils with the higher pH? Up in the Yukon, they're seeing those of 7.5 and up.
Yes. So, and actually, I took that slide out at the last minute. It's everybody. I'm an agronomist. You know, that's the first question whenever I walk onto a farmer's field is, what's your soil pH? And I'll go down a little bit of a rabbit hole here and say that you need to know what your soil pH is. That is a great soil test that is number one for any farmer, because your soils could potentially still have adequate amounts of nutrients, but if your soil pH is a little too low or a little too high, that can be chemically binding those nutrients, like say phosphorus, and not having them plant available. We've done a little bit of research on using products like the Smart Nutrition MAP plus MST on high soil pHs. In general, microbe communities do like a little bit higher soil pH, so I wouldn't expect to see any issues with oxidation rates due to the pH. But if you're up in the Yukon, I'm assuming that the soil temperatures are going to be similar to pretty much anywhere north of I-90 in the US. So you might potentially see oxidation issues due to the cooler soil environments. And so again, taking your sulfur management plan and combining products like Smart Nutrition Met Plus MST and ammonium sulfate could maximize your use efficiency.
We've got quite a few here. Let's take a peek. What's the correlation between a larger sulfur particle and the smaller particle breaking down in the soil?
So if we're focusing on sulfur particle size, there's really not a ratio or say an oxidation release curve per se, because it is so site specific. It is so dependent on weather. But in general, granular elemental sulfur will take months to break down for that sulfur to be available. And more than likely, I think I read the other day that that sulfur was available up to a year later. And so for any farmer that's applying it and say trying to get 2, 3, 4, or 5 years out of that one application, I would expect them to start seeing sulfur deficiencies probably in year 2 or 3. But it all depends on, a lot of times it depends on organic matter. And that's why we asked that poll question, was because a lot of times, yeah, we do think about organic matter, but just how high or just how much sulfur can be supplied by having high organic matter. In general, when we're talking about some of these research sites that we've done work at, we try to focus on sites that have below 3% organic matter, because we're afraid that we're not going to see a sulfur response to fertilizer application. Again, not necessarily a bad thing, but what happens this upcoming year when we're in an El Nino and we're in a state that might be subject to drought, and we don't necessarily have that mineralization of organic matter, and that sulfur is not being supplied to the plant, then that's a good example of when we might see sulfur deficiency and might need an in-season application with AMS. So again, there has been some research done to look at the differences in oxidation rates due to particle size, but it's been in a controlled environment, and just in general, as you decrease the particle size, you should increase the oxidation rate.
Okay, great. Got a few more questions that I think you should have a peek at, so we'll try and get those through. How does the sulfur influence the quality of the protein?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that again?
Does sulfur influence the quality of the protein in the plant?
Yes, but I can't comment specifically on exactly how it affects the protein. All I can say is there is some research being done. I'm pretty sure there's some out of Kansas State that is looking at specific compounds that are that contain sulfur that are automatic or eventually going to affect the protein content. The only comment I have is that adequate nitrogen and sulfur are both needed to maximize protein within the plant. But I'll see what I can find in regards to amino acids and other compounds that are used to make the proteins within the grain.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, we had actually 2 or 3 questions about that here. So 2 more, if you don't mind. Real tactical here. I had plans of applying 140 pounds actual of MST, half with the seed and half in a mid-row band. That would supply 22 pounds of sulfur and 60 pounds of phos. Do you think that half of this rate is too much for canola? Putting you on the
Okay.
spot here.
And I tried to write down as quick as I could. So 100 pounds of MAP plus MST.
Half with the seed, half in a mid-row band. That would be about 22 pounds of S and 60 of P. I'm wondering if this is too much for canola.
The short answer is it could potentially be on it. Oh man, it all depends on your yield goal and what you've seen in previous years. But I can only say that we've seen canola respond up to 36 pounds of sulfur. So I'm a big promoter of on-farm research, and because I can sit here and I can talk to you till I'm blue in the face about management practices, but at the end of the day, you are the only one who knows what's going on your farm. So my suggestion is, if you think it's too much, then maybe, cut your rate down a little bit in one area, or if you think it's not enough, you can always apply more at, say, maybe a different growth stage. It sounds like you've done a good job of split applying, because you know that you do need to apply enough sulfur based on your phosphorus rates. But there's no harm in trying a little test plot on your farm to see if even additional sulfur is available. But always make sure that if you start seeing some flower or bud abortion, that it might potentially be sulfur deficiency.
All right, and one last easy question. Is this product available through a nutrient dealer, or where can we order product from?
The best advice I can give is to check out the smartnutritionmst.com website and reach out, and we'll put you in contact with someone within your area.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Christy. This is the final question for today, but I know that a lot of you have sent in questions, and I will share those with Christy and their team. But please feel free to visit smartnutritionmst.com and visit their Ask an Agronomist page, and they'll be more than happy to connect with you. One last big thank you to our sponsor today, Nutrien Smart Nutrition, MAP plus MST. And before we end, a reminder that this webinar has been approved for 1 CCA CEU credit. If you did not submit your CCA certification number when registering, please email your first and last name and CCA number to webinars@annexbusinessmedia.com. And these instructions will also be found in the follow-up email, which will hold the recording of the webinar. Thanks again for tuning in to today's webinar. Don't forget to visit topcropmanager.com to view all of the previously recorded webinars and watch for upcoming opportunities throughout the coming months. Stay well, safe, and warm, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.